Welcome to the Herd and the Corridor podcast, a podcast about making sense of business within the U.S.-India corridor and beyond. I'm your host, Angela Chitkara. Joining us today is Professor Ioannis, an associate professor at the London Business School and leading expert in sustainability, leadership, and corporate responsibility. His peer-reviewed work has been widely cited with over 15,000 citations in all, and counting. His work focuses on, quote, understanding whether, how, and the extent to which companies and capital markets can lead on the path toward a sustainable future. He also doesn't shy away from voicing his opinions on issues. Such a pleasure. Thanks for making time, Ioannis.
Thank you very much for having me. Really, the pleasure and the privilege is all mine to be here with you today. I'm looking forward to our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Also joining us as co-host and contributors is the first Purpose and Sustainability Executive in Residence at Chapman University and faculty member at Pepperdine University and former Chief Purpose Officer at Omnicom TBWA Chiat, Denise Roberson. And Matt Sekol, Sustainability Black Belt at Microsoft and author of ESG Mindset and a Substack called ESG Advocate. Welcome, Professor Roberson and Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Lovely to be here.
And here's Matt's book. It just came out this year.
Thank you.
Okay, congratulations again, Matt. Okay, so much to discuss. For starters, Ioannis, I had the pleasure in being one of part of your earlier cohorts in your online sustainability course. Would love to start with how has the curricula evolved over the last few years? What are the concerns? What are you hearing from your clients in your consulting capacity?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, needless to mention, Angela, and pretty sure everyone knows on this call as well, these issues are evolving so quickly. And it is so important to keep track. And I'm not only talking about laws and regulations on the environmental or on the social or then the disclosure side, but as a matter of fact, these are issues that are fast evolving in terms of, well, when we talk about environmental issues, the underlying science and how much more we understand these issues, but also perhaps more importantly and perhaps more challengingly, how the social attitudes and the social values are changing. So for instance, we have witnessed some of these issues becoming more highly politicized, arguably contested. Some folks try to present these very fundamental, almost existential challenges that we face through an ideological and a very short-term oriented and myopic way of looking at the challenges without really seeing the big picture. So there's the constant evolution. To some extent, is also complexification. But in my capacity, as you mentioned, both as teaching MBA students, executive MBA students, and interacting a lot with senior executives, I see that there's an increasing understanding of the challenge, but also an increasing appetite in order to tackle these issues. And I'll just give you one anecdote, one example. This year, for instance, at London Business School, our incoming MBA class, ESG and sustainability is the number 2 concentration, another declared concentration by our students that really are interested in examining, exploring, investigating these issues a part of their MBA program. And that's arguably our challenge as business school education as well. I mean, frankly, over the years, we have done enough damage promoting the shareholder primacy and shareholders as the one and only supreme being. So we have a lot to do to increase awareness and understand more of these issues and ultimately not just produce managers, not just produce responsible managers, but actually produce people with a profound understanding of the big picture and the role that business can play into, at least to some extent, contributing positively to these issues.
Thank you. Denise?
Ioannis, that was music to my heart. We share very similar backgrounds and where we spend our time on 2 different sides. And I'm so curious. I see these students like you as our future leaders. But what I'm kind of seeing a gap in education is preparing these students for leadership roles in sustainability and ESG and purpose. What are some of the things universities can do? They notoriously move slowly, but what are some of the things they can do today to help better prepare these students to take on these very important evolving jobs?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Denise. And probably you can answer this question a lot better than I can as well. So I'll be very interested to hear your point of view as well on this. But I think one good starting point is to some extent, stop treating sustainability and ESG and environmental and social issues as optional extras or things that topics that students could only explore in electives. In
Yeah.
my ideal future, these are issues that are core to everything in the core. In other words, how could you possibly study finance these days and not talk about ESG? How could you possibly talk about strategy and not talking about integrating environmental and social issues into the way that we do business? How could you talk about accounting without talking about new and required and mandatory now forms of corporate disclosure? How can you teach organizational behavior without speaking about values and norms and behaviors and beliefs that relate to how we galvanize, how we excite an entire organization for that bigger purpose, if you like, bigger corporate purpose? So I could go on and on for every single one of the core classes as we have typically labeled them. But the idea is that those, in my humble opinion, sustainability and ESG issues, they need to start from the core, and they need to instill that sense of not only awareness, but also urgency and agency in terms of what we can do and how we can explore this. And the second, I'll make 2 points. There's many other issues as well. Is I think that as business schools, we need to learn to partner and collaborate with others. As you all know, sustainability better than I do, sustainability is not a business issue alone. It's a multidimensional, complex issue. We're all still discovering it, to be honest, especially organizations on the ground. So in other words, we need to bring in other disciplines. For instance, I would love to have climate scientists speak to my students. I would love to have biodiversity experts speak to my students. Or I would love to have, I mean, they do, but in a more systematic way, right? As part, not only as guest speakers, but truly integrated into the type of degrees that they do. And also not only on environmental issues. There is, for instance, human rights and the evolution of human rights around the world for things from modern slavery to forced labor and child labor and stuff like that. DEI, contested as it might be in some jurisdictions, is another fundamental component. So, and sometimes we have some expertise, but there's areas where we're lacking. So collaborating and bringing in experts from other fields and other schools is so important, simply because of the complexity of what we are trying to teach.
I could not agree more. And I think that exposure, getting it into the core curriculum, changing hearts and minds, but exposing them to all the various aspects and allowing them to actually touch and engage. I think those partnerships are absolutely critical. So thank you. Yes,
Yeah.
we are very synergistically aligned on this one.
Yeah. And just to add to that, Denise, when we say expose, and we also think, and I think we are aligned on this as well, exposure doesn't only happen in the classroom.
Exactly.
It's a very important component to bring the experience.
Yes.
Right? And I know there's NGOs that already do this, like Earthwatch, that I know here in the UK, that actually take senior executives out in nature. I mean, it's one thing to show you, you know, a graph that shows that the biodiversity collapse. Is really another to go and show you where it happened. That
That's
stays
it.
with you, right?
I would say most people are moved to the point of change either through great trauma or inspiration and awe. And if you can move somebody into that place, they're very receptive to this level of change.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you. Matt, you know, in your recent newsletter and in our conversation from a year ago, you continue to explore IT and the business outcome, the business case rather, for technology. And you've seen this evolution over the years. You also talk about embedding sustainability and DEI.
And Ioannis, this is actually coming back to a post that you made about BSR's great report that was launched just this past week around the future of CSOs. So my background is in IT, and what you actually said about kind of applying multidisciplinary tools to different industries is exactly what I did. I was a liberal arts major. I went right into IT. And when I reflect on my time in IT, I really feel like it's parallel, but not quite the same as what's happening with sustainability offices now. I mean, back when I was back, this was the late 90s, I entered the workforce. Technology underpinned business, but not nearly as much as it did today. And it is fully integrated now. And with AI, even more so. It's just the next round of technology integration in these businesses, driving business value, which, by the way, has its own ESG kind of issues as well. But when it comes to sustainability and ESG, it kind of reminds me of something similar. While the pressure isn't the same, it's not, there's a lot more regulatory pressure with sustainability and ESG, but the end result is still kind of the same. It's this breadth view of the business where there's value to be had, there's risks to be avoided, and it's really becoming kind of a driver of transformation, which is what one of the things was written about in the BSR report that Ioannis posted about this morning. So I think we're really seeing this. We have a framework almost for how this has transformed businesses in the past, and I kind of am optimistic that we're on that journey now, but it just looks a little bit different.
Can I follow up a question for Matt, Angela? Because I think, Matt, I mean, as you know, I'm a big fan of your newsletter, and it's my go-to place for. There's so many important things that you cover in the newsletter, and thank you for that. Do you think, or do you see the evolving role of the CSO as part of this? I would call the scaling up effort, because we all know on this call that, yeah, we might have electric vehicles and solar panels, but ultimately what we want to do is scale them up so we change the energy system, the transportation system. So is this one of the steps that we need to take? Do you see any other steps following from this sort of new structural positions in organizations to help us scale up? And Denise, is that in your experience as well? Is that one of the things that we could do to really get to the systems level change?
Yeah, I think where you both sit, I think, is at the center of where we need to go for change. And whether it's, people who are in college right now getting their masters right after, or whether it's pulling those people in from the workforce, which is also super critical. And I'd love to hear, are you seeing executives sponsor that, or purpose-filled employees just pursuing it? We absolutely need that. And one of the things I wrote about this morning actually was there's a LinkedIn report about green jobs, and it points to the fact that we need twice as many depth type jobs to really do the transformation we need by 2050 for the Paris Agreement. And what struck me immediately about that was that it was not, we need more people that understand the regulations, or we need more sustainability officers to do reports. It was, we need real experts. By the way, I am not a real expert. I am definitely on the breadth side of this. But we need people who understand water, waste, carbon, emissions, efficiencies at the center of the business in order to get these industries, companies first, and then industries more broadly to transform. Absolutely, talent plays a role in that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Matt. And one of the things I will say, and this may be a bit controversial, we took a couple steps forward and a few steps back. A lot of large Fortune 500s let go of their CSOs, their chief purpose officers, their chief impact officers, but a few that made meaningful impact, you can see the difference it makes to have a champion within the corporate boardroom. It's like saying, why do we need a CFO? And that's the question I get daily. Like, what's the purpose? Aren't we all supposed to be doing sustainable things? Aren't we all supposed to be doing purposeful things? Well, yes, but somebody actually has to represent that. Somebody has to champion that, nurture that, and make sure they're ushering in this change at the core operating system of the organization, not out on the periphery.
What is the connection, Ioannis, between ESG and diversity, equity, inclusion? And I know Matt and Denise, you have thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I cannot see them separately, honestly, because I think that the issues are intrinsically related, and also there's huge codependencies with across them, right? Because I'll give you an example. I mean, we do know, for instance, that if you were to consider physical impacts of climate change, is the world's most marginalized and vulnerable communities that are going to suffer. And especially if we talk about the developing world, we're talking about women, for instance, right? So it's not clear to me, this distinction. And that's right, by the way, I'm a big fan of actually talking about ESG as opposed to breaking it down, because breaking it down is great when you want to add depth, and we need to add depth, but we should never forget these huge interdependencies, and that these issues can get us to tipping points. Is the corporate equivalent of the planetary boundaries. You cannot look at biodiversity laws without accounting for its impact on climate change, and vice versa. It's the same thing when we talk about ESG. We talk about the transition. And who's going to transition, right? The organizations are just legal entities. It's the people within the organizations that need to transition. It's the people that within organizations that need to reflect the rich diversity of the society in which they seek the social license to operate. So how could they possibly seek the social license to operate when they do not include all aspects of the society in which they're supposed to operate? And clearly different groups will have different needs, but also different groups can contribute differently. And I'll say one more thing. I'll be very curious to see what Denise and Matt have to say about this. I am a bit averse to the discussion about the link, especially when we talk about diversity issues or DEI issues, to link between so-called DEI and performance. I would hate to think that we live in a sad world where, unless it's profitable, we don't care about the diversity of the society in which we live in, and we only do it for the money, right? That's, for me, that's another sort of, it's the idea of greed just cast in a different way, right? And the whole idea here is that, in my view at least, when we talk about corporate responsibilities, to move beyond just the dollar value. That's what it means to build a more sustainable, a more responsible and sustainable capitalism. So we need to expand that idea that in addition to sort of extrinsic, in other words, monetary and instrumental motivations, there is intrinsic motivation, and there is intrinsic rewards, ultimately, as we try to build a better, more sustainable and a fairer society. Does that, Matt and Denise, reflect how you might be thinking about DEI?
Oh boy, yes, it is. And I will tell you, I have spent the last many years in corporate boardrooms and with the C-suite building these business cases. It was the epicenter. And what I actually realized was the people that were continuing and building something robust with meaningful change were the ones that just realized it was the right thing to do from the jump. Yes, we can build in business case. Yes, we can build in ways to try and safeguard these initiatives, to help foster them and nurture them. But at the end of the day, there's just something to be said for having an ethos that helping people and helping the planet is the right thing to do. So I agree completely with that, Ioannis.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't think I could say anything better. The only thing I would add is the downside, which is right now a lot of companies. And Denise, you just mentioned this about the sustainability side. It's happening on the DE&I side as well. We're seeing a pushback on DE&I, especially over here in the US, that is really counterproductive to any sort of systemic process and wildly disappointing. But there are companies that are sticking it out. And I think, Denise, it's to what you said, it's the companies that really have recognized the value in doing this. And sometimes there is business value in doing it, and sometimes it's the right thing to do. But either way, when companies kind of look at this, their stakeholders, they understand how to approach it from the perspective of their business, at least. In my mind, it becomes more defensible. You can go back to those people and say, you know what? This is what we do. This is who we are. This is part of our purpose. We're going to just keep doing it. You know, complain all you want, I guess, boycott us, but this is good for us, and we're just going to keep doing it. And it's good for society. So leave us alone.
that sometimes it's I think people confuse two things: the intention, motivation versus the outcome, right? Because when you focus on the monetary or the business case, you're focusing on the outcome, and the two are cannot they're not incompatible. Might well say, I'm going to have a diverse workforce or work on DI because it's the right thing to do, and that's the motivation, and you might as well be able to create value, and I mean monetary value as well as societal value as an outcome. Right? It doesn't. I don't understand why the two ought to be contradictory, and we should not be confusing that. That everyone is the Homo economicus, and everyone on this planet does everything only when there's a dollar value. I mean, that's what they taught us to think, right? That's the Homo economicus model, which we know it doesn't work. I mean, again, we'll be living in a very sad world if everyone thought that way, right? And that's a world I wouldn't want to live in if everyone was a Homo economicus. But that's not the case. I mean, of course, we need the profit motive. I mean, I'm not here to preach that we don't need it, and frankly, even on ethical grounds, we need it. Why? Because it is the profit and the margin that allows for scale. You might have the best DEI, but if you cannot scale it up, you're not solving or contributing to a systemic issue. It's the same idea: intention versus outcome. You can have the intention to do the right thing. The outcome allows you to be profitable, which then allows you to scale up and do the right thing even more. It's honestly, this contradiction sometimes I often feel in this space in general happens purely on ideological grounds, and people that need to create political controversy so that they gain votes in the short run. I'll share with you. I'm actually trying to write down my thoughts on this, because I have the title of a piece that I want to write, and it's called "Neither Left Nor Right, Only Forward with ESG." And it's kind of saying, take this out of the political debate. It is not chances are that the solutions we're going to need are going to have elements of both. They're going to have elements of market solutions and elements of regulatory solutions. If you shoehorn them into one or the other, guess what? You create polarization, and you impede progress, and that's precisely what we're witnessing now. And by the way, the last thing I'm going to say here is that is any of us on this call surprised that DEI became a controversy? Like, oil and gas companies were undermining climate science before in the 70s, right? Tobacco companies were undermining studies that shows that smoking causes cancer ages ago. It's anything really that upsets vested interest gets a pushback. So I actually consider that a good thing, in the sense that if ESG or DEI did not matter, nobody would push back against them. The fact that they are pushing back against them, it means that it is upsetting some of these vested interests. And so that's a good thing. I mean, there's many reasons why organizations face inertia. One we mentioned earlier might be literally lack of expertise. So if you don't have the human capital to understand these things, of course you cannot bring about change. Also, we know this from outside the ESG or sustainability context. Companies are victims of their own success. If the way they did things before led them to success, they will just keep doing things like they did them before. And at some point, they'll face the harsh reality. I mean, I often say to my students, look at the corporate graveyard. It's packed with once iconic brands that failed to navigate disruptions. Sears, Kodak, Polaroid, Blockbuster. The list is endless. So there is resistance, fine. But that also tells me that your resistance is not just about ESG and sustainability. You're simply not an agile organization. Because forget about inherently caring about these issues. If you want to be a good executive, you want to function in a stakeholder system in which you are a good fit. Now, if your customers are demanding environmentally and socially responsible products and services, if your investors are demanding ESG information, if the regulator is regulating more and more environmental and social issues, if you have activists at your door every morning demanding that you do better, if you have demands for supply chain transparency and accountability that you never had before, if you face all of those things on Monday morning and you inherently even don't care about these issues, you're not, I mean, how could you be a good executive without actually dealing with them, right? So this is not, it's great that, of course, it links to the existential issue of sustainability, but this is a profound adaptation challenge. And we have to be honest. There will be organizations that they will resist hard, and ultimately they will die out, because you know what? For every organization that resists, there's 1,000 entrepreneurs that are trying to do better and replace them. That's the story of business, right? So nothing new there, but also, nothing old in that respect, right?
What are your recommendations in how to, you're talking about how to think, but how do you actually apply? How do you do this hard work? Where do you start?
Oh boy, that's how long do we have? I'll keep it brief, because I would love to hear what Denise and Matt think about this. But I think that the overarching story is that it has to be a phased approach. It cannot be, these are not things that change overnight. So clearly in the sustainability space, there's different levels of maturity depending on where the organization starts. So some of them start with a crisis, right? Look at Nike and the sweatshops, look at Volkswagen and the Dieselgate, and look at Nestle and the baby formula. There's companies that start with a crisis. There's others that progress to simple compliance, and then they start exploring the low-hanging fruit. For some of these ESG issues, there are off-the-shelf solutions. They're not going to give you a strategy, but they're going to give you some cost benefits sometimes. So, and then, once you build momentum, capability, perhaps human capital and knowledge, you can progress to changing your strategy and perhaps ultimately finding a bigger purpose and trying to contribute to a bigger system. So the one piece of advice I would say is look at sustainability in a phased sort of way, in a staged sort of way, and move at the speed that is aligned with, well, ultimately how quickly your organization can move and the context in which you function. So the second thing is, for me, there's two mechanisms at play that co-evolve over time. It's how willing and how able you are to address a particular issue. And the willingness builds upon the beliefs, the norms, the identity of the organization. And truth of the matter is, you cannot go beyond that, right? If the beliefs are not there, if the norms are not there, you need to start building that foundation before you bring about any organizational change. But even if you build those, then you have to look at a broadly defined cost-benefit analysis. Companies don't have infinite resources. They don't have infinite capabilities either. And there's certainly no one company that is going to address all of the world's challenges. So you need to break down that problem. What does it mean for our industry? What is material? And what can be addressed? And over what time horizon? So it has to be a staged approach, and that kind of balances out the willingness and the ability as you go along.
That was a great summary of your course, Ioannis. Thank you. Okay, Matt.
That was at the back of my mind, yes.
Matt, it was very excellent. It was excellent. Matt.
I don't know what I could possibly add to that, but I will try. What I'd say is companies are sitting on a wildly untapped resource. Coming out of COVID, coming out of the murder of George Floyd, like what I'm seeing is employees are filled with a sense of purpose. And I find this, I get reach outs from people on LinkedIn all the time. How did you pivot from IT to sustainability and ESG? Because they want to do that. And companies are filled with people like this. I think from the bottom up, we are covered. There are people out there who are willing to engage. From the top down, I'm not so sure. I know a lot of boards are talking about ESG. They're thinking about it. But the chief sustainability officer is still focused on reporting right now, still trying to get that first CSRD report out. And they are not mainstreaming this topic around the business. And so what's happening is you may end up with a lot of employees that are kind of rudderless. They're full of ambition, making all sorts of suggestions, not necessarily feeling heard. And maybe in some cases they're acting, maybe in some cases they're not. I think companies are missing the opportunity to really channel that energy. And what I think we kicked off this conversation with is exactly one of the ways to do it. To give them the education, upskill the people who know your business best about this topic, give them the perspective and empower them to execute. And there's no telling what will happen.
Thank you. Denise?
I would say I would agree with everything that's been said, but add to that a mistake that I see quite often, and that is starting with your external audience, with comms, with PR, with an initiative, which is lovely. But if you want to make real and meaningful change, start with your corporate culture, start with your employees, embed that, make sure that you have that conversation internally, and that all the way to the front lines, they are feeling what it is that you're trying to accomplish and know how to be a part of it. I can't tell you how many organizations I've seen that have sort of stopped at the vice president or mid-level manager level and decided to go externally before their entire workforce was able to engage in a deep and meaningful way. So get your culture in order, really do your due diligence before you go external and build that really strong.
I think disclosure is, as we all know, it's a huge topic on ESG and sustainability. But I'm hopeful and I'm optimistic because finally, after so many years, I do feel that we're getting slowly out of what I was calling in the past this muddy middle, this confusion of acronyms, this abundance of reporting frameworks. In other words, we've migrated into the convergence stage, right? With, of course, the CSRD, the disclosure law in the European Union being the perhaps at this point the most stricter but also the most comprehensive, then followed by IFRS and what they did with ISSB in the United States, for the time being only focusing on environmental issues and financial materiality, but they will get there to the whole ESG and to the double materiality of the European Union. And I do think that on another note of optimism, not only are we seeing convergence, but we also see a cascading effect, right? Because as you mentioned, it's India, it's China, it's Brazil, some of the largest countries and economies around the world, and what we are emerging economies around the world. And what we're going to see is that there's already, as far as I know, at least, a very frank dialogue in terms of how do we translate these standards, how we implement these standards globally. Because ultimately, as you'll see, these issues cannot be isolated in regions. That's why the European Union at some point was discussing, for instance, a border adjustment tax for carbon. You're not going to be able to undermine domestic low carbon producers by bringing high carbon intensity products from abroad. You'll be taxed at the border. And that obviously is going to create an effect globally. And in order to do that, you'll need information, you will need data. That's why ultimately the European law actually says you cannot just set up a subsidiary in Ireland and only tell us what that subsidiary is doing. If you have a corporate parent, you're going to tell us the whole story. If you have a particular presence in the European Union, inevitably that's going to cause and it already is causing cascading effects. Also, the role of capital. Financial institutions don't only invest locally, they invest internationally, right? They invest globally. The same applies with the asset management industry. They have disclosure requirements about all of their investments that are global. So necessarily, this is also going to cascade. So we are in that process, as you mentioned, in not only in India, but also in China, in Brazil, and so on, where we see them adopting ESG disclosures. Perhaps some of them more forward than others in terms of this choice between financial or double materiality, but you have to start from somewhere. My understanding is that India is on the double materiality front, and so is Brazil, path, and so is Brazil. So the short story is convergence and cascading effects are already happening, which is gives me optimism that very soon we'll be out of that muddy middle and have much more better information on which to ultimately base policies actually on these issues.
Okay, excellent, Ioannis. And what about AI and sustainability reports as we look to 2025? There's a lot of concern about greenwashing and just risk.
Yes, greenwashing is a huge topic. We talk about for hours about this. I think that my position though is slightly different, perhaps that most people's. I think that we ought to detect intentional deceiving and punish it characteristically harsh, right? For me, there's no question about that. If it's intentional, then it's criminal, right? And we need to detect that. However, we need to be extremely careful on how we do that. Why is that the case? Because companies are trying to solve very difficult issues. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? It means that they will experiment and they will fail. And they will fail multiple times. And they also may be partially successful instead of fully successful. And they may also try and discover that we don't have the technologies. We don't have the materials that we need. There is no viable alternative. So what we don't want to do is frame cases of partial success and partial failure or complete failure with good intentions as greenwashing. That would be detrimental because that's going to stifle innovation, absolutely necessary innovation that we need. It's going to constrain or eliminate experimentation that we absolutely need in order to solve these problems. And ultimately, it might lead to diminished disclosure because firms are managing a so-called greenwashing risk. Now, this is a huge challenge for regulators. You know why? Because usually laws and regulations judge you on the outcome. They don't judge you on the intention, right? I mean, so here though, on these topics, if you always judge on the outcome, you run a lot of risks in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, killing experimentation, killing risk appetite, which you ought to have if you're going to find the solutions that we need. So we need to balance that. We need to harshly punish those that do it deliberately and criminally, but we need to find a way, and we have a lot of smart regulators in the world, to find a way to combine this idea of intention and outcomes and not punish outcomes without considering intentions.
Ioannis, thank you so much for joining us. I so appreciate your time. You were a wonderful professor in the classroom, and I learned a lot, and you're contributing greatly to the world along with Matt and Denise. So thank you again. I admire all of you so much. And that was Professor Ioannou of London Business School, along with Matt Sekol at Microsoft and Professor Denise Roberson of Chapman University. Thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, I'll see you in the corridor.